All right, welcome back, everybody. We're into Unit 4 now, talking about classical Africa and the Middle East. Like I said at the start of this unit, the majority of our focus is going to be on Persia because it really represents one of the first and one of the greatest of those classical empires that we're going to talk about throughout this thing. Rome, China, the Guptas, on and on. But we'll get to those. However, we will hit on some of the kingdoms of classical Africa and the role they kind of play in this newly expanding classical era, right? This era of more interaction, more regional expansion, the building of true empires and states. So, the recommended supplemental viewing for this unit, there's a couple of links there. I highly recommend the Engineering and Empire Persia. It gives a really good overview of the empire itself, the massiveness of the building that the Persians do. Persians are known, along with the Romans, as probably one of the great builders of all of the classical empires. The history of ancient Africa is really excellent if you want to get some more detail about Axum and Kush, specifically Axum. And then Battles BC, that's just a really good show from the History Channel back when they actually used to show history. This one deals with the Battle of Marathon, which is really the decisive battle in the Greco-Persian Wars. I mean, I know that Thermopylae and the 300 gets a lot of attention because Leonidas and this is Sparta and dudes with fake painted on abs. But Marathon is actually the battle that's far more decisive than Thermopylae ever was. All right, so let's get into it. So let's start with two of the really important kingdoms of Africa during this time period. The first is Kush, also known as Nubia. The people of this area refer to themselves as the Nubians. The Nubians occupied the southern Nile River Valley. Essentially, they are, I guess, for lack of a better term, neighbors with Egypt. Um, the Nile River connects the both of them. They have very strong cultural, very strong economic ties to Egypt through the Nile River Valley trade. Nubians also occupy a very important role in the Egyptian military for quite a long time, centuries. Um, Many thousands of Nubians functioned as mercenaries. Specifically, Nubian archers were highly prized by the Egyptian military. So there is a long history of interaction between Nubia and Egypt. Um, Nubia's success is almost entirely built around trade. The city of Meroe in southern Nubia is, for a long time, the centralized hub if you are looking to purchase goods from sub-Saharan Africa. Um, Ivory, gold, tortoise shells, slaves, especially salt. Okay, we talked way back in the first unit about the importance of salt when it comes to preserving food. Um, Now, through that trade, Nubia slash Kush continues to grow. They become, very economically strong. Even so, to the point where around 100 CE or so, as Egypt is being weakened by invasions from neighbors and political infighting, the Nubians actually advance into Egypt and conquer Egypt and rule it for roughly about a century. This just goes to further strengthen those ties between the two. Egyptian polytheism is pretty heavily adopted in Nubia. They also adopt Egyptian hieroglyphics as their state form of writing. Now, Nubia itself has a lot of very common features of the other classical civilizations. It is a monarchy. It is patriarchal, although you would occasionally have a woman on the throne. Um, you also have the divinity of the monarchy, again, that religious justification for power, the idea of I'm in charge because the gods or God put me here. Um, Now, Kush begins to decline shortly after their expulsion from Egypt, mainly because they are now competing against larger, more powerful empires for control of Egypt and the Nile and North Africa, specifically Persia and Rome. And as Rome expands into North Africa, as Persia begins to expand into North Africa, they begin to steer the trade routes in the area away from the Nile and more towards the Red and Mediterranean seas, which obviously is going to benefit them. And as that trade is steered in other directions, well, the economic power that once funded Kush and its military strength begins to slowly dissipate to the point where in the 4th century CE, they are conquered by their neighbors and rivals in Axum. Now, just a couple examples of the remains of Nubian culture. You can see pretty clearly from these examples the heavy influence that Egyptian culture had on Nubian. This is a tomb for Nubian royalty. And you can see almost universally an adoption of Egyptian style hieroglyphs. You can see Egyptian styles of dress on both the women and the men, with um, the headwear as well as the traditional Egyptian beard for men. All right. Some more pictures here. You can clearly see the Egyptian influence here in these Nubian remains. The buildings are decorated with essentially carvings of Egyptian gods. So the ties between the two groups are pretty strong. Now, replacing Kush as the dominant African kingdom in this region is Axum. All right. Axum is founded in what we call the Horn of Africa, modern day Ethiopia. And as those trade routes slowly move away from the Nile and towards the Red Sea, Axum becomes one of the beneficiaries of that. They have access to the Red Sea, they have access to the Indian Ocean. And as those trade routes uh, begin to diminish along the Nile, which weakens Kush, they simultaneously strengthen Axum's position. And Axum and Kush begin to compete in the area for dominance over that sub-Saharan trade. Eventually, Axum overruns Kush in the 4th century CE, basically making them the dominant power when it comes to trade in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, involvement in these Red Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Indian Ocean trade routes not only brings money and wealth to Axum, but it also brings a lot of cultural influence. Mainly and most importantly is the introduction of Christianity into Axum. Around 330 CE, Christian missionaries who have been in Axum for decades by this point, are able to convert the king of Axum, King Izana, to Christianity. Most of, but not all of his kingdom follows suit, and Axum becomes the first Christian state in Africa. Um, Now, that Indian Ocean and Red Sea trade, again, just like it did for Kush in earlier centuries, strengthens Axum, leads to expansion. The kingdom of Axum invades the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century. We already talked about in the 4th century how they overrun Kush, become the dominant power in the area. However, this dominance does not last forever. In fact, it lasts maybe only about another 150 years or so. As Islam begins to rise and expand in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE, Axum starts to see a massive decline. As Muslims become the dominant force in the region, they begin to shift their trade routes away from Christian states like Axum, and they begin to send caravans across the Sahara Desert directly, essentially cutting Axum out of the majority of the profit that they had been enjoying for several eventually, Axum and modern day Ethiopia is absorbed into the Islamic Caliphate, becomes part of mainly Muslim North Africa. But Ethiopia itself and a large portion of the population remains heavily Christian all the way into modern time. Now, in terms of the kingdoms of Africa, a couple of things to make sure that you take away from this. Number one, the importance of trade to the success of these African kingdoms. In the case of both Axum and Kush, as the trade dries up, as new trade routes develop, as existing trade routes turn away from their civilizations, you see how quickly, and I know it's not quickly, it's hundreds of years, but in the big picture, it's quickly, how quickly the support and the financial success and therefore the military success of those kingdoms evaporates along with the trade. Another really important thing to take away, and this is going to be kind of a theme, especially with sub-Saharan Africa going forward, is as these kingdoms become more involved in these large-scale trade networks with the rest of the world, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, India, Asia, more and more cultural diffusion and more cultural influence makes its way into Africa. Right. So if you take nothing else away from it, make sure that you pay attention to those two themes, right? The importance of trade to these African kingdoms and to classical empires in general, and how trade plays a massive role in diffusing cultural beliefs and ideas and bringing them into areas where they previously hadn't existed. All right, so that's it for the African kingdoms. We'll come back. We'll talk about Persia and all the things we need to know there.